Guys, so we are going to get into our lesson for today. We are doing GAF 9, solving equations notes. We're going to start with solving multi-step equations, and then notice later on we're going to do factoring quadratics, and then factoring cubic and quartic functions. Okay, so starting with our absolute value, okay, anytime that we have an absolute value problem where we're finding the zeros or the y-intercept, we're solving the absolute value, we want to do a few things. So I'm just going to write some notes here on the side. So for absolute value, okay, the first thing that we want to do is we're going to want to isolate the absolute value bars. Okay, so these two lines right here represent those absolute value bars. Okay. The second thing that we're going to want to do is, of course, separate into two equations, and I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like. So into two equations, okay, and we're going to be using the definition of absolute value to go ahead and display that. So using the definition of absolute value, okay. One thing that I want us to note is we always have to watch out for the absolute value equaling a negative number. If this is the case, then the absolute value has no solution. Okay? All right. So, getting right into our problem, okay? So remember it says we're going to isolate the absolute values first. So in other words, we want all of the stuff around the absolute values away from the absolute value bars, okay? Remember that when we are finding the zeros, okay, quick note that the zeros are also, another word is going to be the x-intercepts. So remember when we're looking for the x-intercepts, you're going to set y equal to 0. F of x is just a fancy way of writing y. So I'm going to set f of x equal to 0. So negative x plus 2 plus 1. Okay. So I'm going to start by getting rid of this plus 1. So I have minus 1 on both sides. Okay. So negative 1 is equal to negative x plus 2. Okay. All right, now that I have our negative 1, we want to get rid of this negative. Okay, in order to do that, we're going to divide by negative 1. Remember, when there's not a number here, we can assume there's a 1. So I'm going to divide by negative 1 on both sides. That'll allow me to cancel out these negatives along with these here. So I'm going to bring down that 1. And now I have isolated my absolute value bars, which is what I wanted. Okay, so if we do not remember from algebra 2, our absolute value is going to be our distance from 0. Okay, so in other words, this is telling us that what's inside these bars is one distance, right? The equal sign tell us is in a sentence form, equals is, okay? So this, what's inside the absolute value bars, that tells us that we're 1 unit away from 0. So if we had a number line, okay, we are 1 unit away from 0. Okay. Also, by definition, anything that is in the absolute value bars is always going to result in positive, which is why, if you remember, we watch out for the absolute value not equaling a negative number, because that would be no solution. The absolute value always has to end in a positive value, okay? So since it's always going to be positive, that doesn't mean that it wasn't negative at one point, okay? So let me show you what that looks like, okay? So we're going to write it in two different ways. So we're going to have x plus 2 is equal to positive 1, okay? Or x plus 2 is equal to negative 1, right? Because our absolute value will always result in 1. So although this is negative, it's always going to result in 1, in positive 1, okay? So then we're just going to follow our steps and solve for x. So I'm going to subtract 2 on both sides. So I'm going to have x equals -1. On the other hand, I'm going to have x is equal to -3. Okay. All right. So now we can go ahead and write these as points. So our x equals -1. We can write that as -1 comma 0. And our x equals -3. We can write that as -3 comma 0. Okay, so in this case we have 2 zeros, and that is because our absolute value is always going to result in positive, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't have had a negative value. Okay, all right. So for our y-intercept, okay, our y-intercept, remember we're going to set x equal to 0. Okay, so we have y equals -x plus 2 plus 1. Go ahead and put 0, negative plus 1. Okay, so y equals 1. Okay, in this case, our value inside the absolute value bars is already positive. Okay, so we're just going to bring down that 2. If it was negative, okay, so if we had a negative here, we would still write it as x equals -2 because our absolute value bars always result in a positive value. Okay, so y equals -2 plus 1. In case we are wondering, this negative is on the outside of the absolute value bars, which is why we had the absolute value bars here and we still have this positive 2. Okay, so once we took the absolute value of 2, we still have that negative, and that is why we have that -2. Okay, now it's kind of weird, or confusing. So please go back, kind of watch. If you need a little bit more help, you can always come ask me. Okay, so y equals -2 plus 1 is going to be -1. Okay, we can also write this as 0 comma -1. Okay. So moving on to our next function, we have f of x equals 3/4 x plus 4. Okay, we want to find the zeros. We're going to start with the zeros. Reminder that that is also the x-intercept, so we're going to set y equal to 0. So 0 equals 3/4 square root of x plus 4. Okay, we're going to, of course, want to get rid of any outside values. Okay, so outside of the casita, I like to call this a little casita, we're going to get rid of this 3/4. Okay, I'm going to start by multiplying by the denominator because we want to undo this division. We want to get rid of this fraction. Okay, so we're going to undo the division by multiplying by the denominator. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply by the denominator on both sides. I'm still going to end up with 0 because 4 times 0 is just 0. Okay. Now I have that this is being multiplied, so I'm going to divide both sides by 3. Okay, this is just going to, again, result in 0 equals x plus 4. Okay, now to undo the square root, we're going to square both sides. Okay, 0 squared is, again, just 0. Okay. Now we can go ahead and get rid of the little casita, and we're left with x plus 4. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and subtract 4 from both sides, and I'm left with x equals -4. I can also write this as -4 comma 0. Right, not too bad for our square root function. I'm going to go ahead and find the y-intercept by setting x equal to 0. Okay, so y equals 3/4 x plus 4. Setting x equal to 0. Okay, I want to simplify what's inside the radical. Okay, so 0 plus 4 is just 4. The square root of 4 is going to be 2. Okay, so I can now get rid of the radical, right? The square root of 4 is 2. And now I'm just going to multiply across. So I have 3 times 2 is 6 over 4. Simplifying that, you should get 3 halves. Okay, you can also write this as 1.5. Okay, I'm going to write it as a fraction just because I like fractions for some reason. Okay, and our y-intercept is 0, 3 over 2. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and see you in the next video when we start talking about solving quadratics and quartic and cubic functions.